Hello everyone, and welcome to Group 2's presentation on Dada and Surrealism by Hannah, Rachel, and Adrian. Here is a look at the material that we will cover in this presentation. The major questions we will be covering this week are: how did Marcel Duchamp and the Dada movement challenge the traditional notion of art and art making? And what are the innovative approaches of Surrealist artists towards art and reality? So vocabulary terms related to the Dada movement include automatism, biomorphic, ready-mades, photomontage, and assemblage. Terms related to surrealism include biomorphic surrealism, naturalistic surrealism, frottage, decalcomania, and the paranoid critical method. Introduction. Fantasy, wonder, and imagination has fascinated humanity throughout the history of art. The allure of hallucinatory visions in art, from the Romanesque portrayal of heaven and hell in Hieronymus Bosch's Garden of Earthly Delights, to the illusionistic Baroque ceiling painting of Andrea Pozzo in the Church of St. Ignazio, is precisely what inspired the Dadaist and the Surrealist in the second and the third decades of the 20th century. This presentation will explore how the Dada and Surrealist movements would challenge traditional notions of art and its production, and we will examine exactly how these artists would express their new understanding of reality in their work. Rousseau. Beginning in the early 19th century, the West would be plunged into a period of rationalistic materialism, with a rediscovery of the irrational emerging later in the century through the writings of Baudelaire, the advent of symbolist poetry, and the Freudian theories of psychoanalysis in the early 20th century. Artists would once again explore fantastic content in their art. Fantasist artists such as Henri Rousseau, Marc Chagall, and Giorgio de Chirico would prepare the way for Dada and Surrealist artists painting in Paris just before World War I. Rousseau, for example, with his childlike, naive, primitive, and exotic imagery, as we see here in his final masterpiece titled The Dream, portray in a seductive jungle scene a lady reclining on a Victorian couch in meticulous detail. The lion, bison, birds, tropical fruits, and flowers combine to create the supernatural and poetic in an eerie spaciousness. De Chirico. De Chirico would also play an essential role through his powerful and intense creation of authentic and troubling dreamlike imagery, as we see here in his work titled The Soothsayer's Recompense. Painted in 1913 at the height of Cubism in Paris, his image of the haunting cityscape, freezing reality into a trance-like mobility with conflicting vanishing points and deep contrast of shadow and light, would be unlike anything else at that time. Hugo Ball and Dada. In the midst of the chaos, confusion, and carnage of World War I, the German poet Hugo Ball would found the Dada group in 1916 in Zurich, Switzerland. Inspired by the new fantasy world portrayed in the art of Rousseau and de Chirico, Dada would protest the futility and charade of World War, unlocking the new sources of spontaneity, fantasy, and formal artistic invention to redefine the nature of the artistic experience. The founding members of the Zurich group would include a group of exiles from the war, including writer Richard Huelsenbeck, poet Tristan Tzara, painter Marcel Janco, and painter and sculptor Jean Arp. Jean Arp. Using the futurist strategy of insult and outrage, the Dadaist would use artistic parody and subversion to bewilder and intimidate spectators, such as deafening music, accidental poems, and experiments in artistic automatism to create collage and sculpture, such as John Arp's arrangement according to the laws of chance, with a random array of paper squares torn and pasted on paper. Automatism, as pioneered by Dadaism, would directly challenge the traditional notion of art as a purposeful and composed practice of the artist. Arp would be a major sculptural figure to emerge in the Zurich group that would reflect the inventive disorder and wit of Dadaism, whose chance creations would help form the basis of the Surrealist movement to come. Also included here is an example of his later Surrealist sculpture. Marcel Duchamp. Another primary innovator in the spirit of Dada would be the talented French cubist Marcel Duchamp. His nude descending a staircase, exhibited in the Armory Show of 1913, would take the New York art world by storm. His mechanized nude would challenge the technological world of the futurist and cubist, opening a dialogue on the conquest of man by machine. Arriving in New York City in 1915, he would pioneer the notion of anti-art, refusing to make elitist distinctions about the art object and raising questions about what makes something art. Ready-mades. Breaking from artistic tradition, Duchamp conceived of a work of art as something that could be painted, constructed, or merely designed by the artist. This designation, which Duchamp called ready-made, will break down the defining primary attribute of a work of art, namely its privileged status as fine art, confusing the traditional hierarchy of artistic values. Duchamp's first ready-made would be his The Fountain. To demonstrate the point that the choice of a ready-made was never dictated by aesthetic selection alone, Duchamp would exhibit a porcelain urinal which he titled The Fountain in 1917 at the Society of Independence show in New York City. Duchamp would sign the work using a pseudonym, R. Mutt, playing on the name of a well-known cartoon character, Mutt. As a visual pun, the fountain could be interpreted as suggestive of both male and female sexual organs. Not surprisingly, it would be rejected by his own artistic peers and be the catalyst for an ongoing public discussion in the modern art world about what should be considered art. Dada in Germany. From 1918 to 1920, Dada spread from Zurich to Germany, taking an overtly political stance in art, linked with communism and militant politics. Richard Huelsenbeck would comment that in Germany, the artistic activity was entirely different, assuming a very definite political character. Artist Hannah Hawk and Raoul Hassmann would be the first to use photographic images to create photomontage in dramatic ways to comment on the ills of capitalism and militarism in Germany, as seen in Hawk's Cut with the Kitchen Knife. Kurt Schwitters, New Materials. In Hanover, Germany, Kurt Schwitters would use commonplace object fragments taken directly from life, as we see in his collage Mers 94 Grünfleck. This novel use of everyday objects would address Duchamp's notion of anti-art in a new way while extending the material possibilities of artistic expression beyond the restrictive artistic tradition of canvas and oil paint. Schwitters would explain the use of commonplace materials, saying that Mers stands for freedom for all fetters. For the sake of artistic creation, every artist must be allowed to mold a picture out of nothing. Transition from Dada to Surrealism. With the assistance of John Arp, Max Ernst, working in Cologne, Germany, would create collages and paintings of remarkable visual and psychological impact with an almost hallucinatory power. His elephant, Celebs, was a boiler-bodied monster swinging cows. André Breton. Unlike Dadaism, Surrealism was a highly organized group of artists and writers who gathered around André Breton in Paris in 1924 when he published his Surrealist Manifesto. While originally a primarily literary movement, taking its name from Apollinaire's 1917 The Breast of Tiresias, a surrealist dream, artists soon became interested in the ideas as well. Surrealist artists began to employ new methods of inspiration in their artwork, taking into consideration the work of Sigmund Freud and focusing on the mind and dreams. The Surrealist artists were judged by their ability to evoke unconscious material instead of on their artistic talent. Rather than taking inspiration from the outside world, the Surrealists looked inward for a revelation in order to create an enigma. The key figures in the Surrealist movement include Salvador Dali, André Breton, Juan Miró, Giorgio de Chirico, Max Ernst, René Magritte, and André Masson, among others. Types of Surrealism. With Surrealism, there are two stylistic groups, biomorphic and naturalistic. Originally, biomorphic surrealism was the primary form tied to a technique called automatism, in which the writer or artist simply begins writing or drawing without thinking in an attempt to unlock the subconscious. We see here Max Ernst, the Horde, as an example of this, in which he used a technique called frottage. Masson, Miró, and Ernst dominated these techniques in the first few years of Surrealism. With the emergence of René Magritte and Yves Tanguy in 1926 and 1927, a contrasting style which fixed hallucinatory and fantastic subject matter and meticulously painted images of academic precision and clarity became a viable alternative. By 1929, Salvador Dali joined the Surrealists, and the illusionistic technique became the dominant form. Biomorphic Surrealism, André Masson. André Masson joined the Surrealists shortly after meeting Breton in 1924. It was then that he developed a system of automatic drawing to mimic Breton's automatic writing. Battle of the Fishes is an example of him putting this process into practice in combination with pouring sand onto glue-covered areas of the canvas to further randomize the image. His metamorphic hybrids demonstrate a blending of animal violence and reflections of human passion. Juan Miró. Juan Miró was a surrealist painter during that time, and he can be seen as the antithesis to Dali. Rather than illustrating his dreams as Dali was, Miró tried to recreate the dream experience in his work. Labeled by Breton as the most surrealist of us all, Miró never wanted to be assimilated with any school. Introduced to surrealist writings by Masson, Miró quickly took Max Ernst, frottage, and decalcomania. As mentioned previously, Max Ernst was one of the primary surrealists to use a process called frottage, in which the artist created rubbings from natural materials and then left them mainly unaltered to create visions of landscapes and creatures. Prompted by repeating imagery, Ernst elaborated his work to include a bird person called Lop Flop and other characters called the Forest and the Hordes, all of which can be seen in his titles. Later on, Ernst explored a technique developed by Oscar Dominguez called decalcomania, in which he lifted paint off of paper or glass surface with another surface to which the medium adhered. The painting here, titled Europe After the Rain, is an example of this process. It was executed in the United States, where Ernst fled during World War II, and it is believed to be an anti-fascist work expressing his turmoil for the violence happening in Europe. Naturalistic Surrealism, Yves Tanguy. As mentioned previously, Tanguy was one of the artists who was part of the turn from biomorphic to naturalistic surrealism. After seeing a painting by de Chirico, he was so moved that he created Mama, Papa is Wounded. Influenced by de Chirico's statuesque figures and hallucinatory sense of space, Tanguy's paintings were characterized by dreamlike landscapes and amoeba-esque forms completed in meticulous detail. René Magritte. Magritte was a Belgian artist who associated with Breton's Surrealist group from 1927 to 1930. The work of Magritte contained fantastic objects painted in meticulous realism, or the placement of ordinary objects in odd places, making them fantastic, which we can see in his pieces The Treachery of Images and The Human Condition 1. In these paintings, he problematized our relationship between the image, reality, and the conventions we use to represent them, such as symbols and the written word. As Magritte himself said, an object is not so attached to its name that one cannot find another one which might suit it better. Salvador Dali. Salvador Dali was a main player in the evolution of Surrealism. Although he ended up pushing away the Surrealist group with his ego, his work became the forerunner for Surrealist art in America. His Persistence of Memory from 1931 was purchased by Julian Levy, who had introduced Surrealist painting to the United States. He also helped to revive the Surrealist experiments with great momentum with his paranoid critical method. The paranoid critical method can be explained as a spontaneous method of irrational knowledge based on the critical and systematic objectification of delirious associations and interpretations. Simply put, the deliberate substitution of Dalinian hallucinations for observed reality. Dali believed that the paranoid can see more than one reality, and his paranoid critical activity can be seen through his use of double imagery. Un chant andalou. One of the significant moments in Dali's career was his film Un chant andalou that he made with Louis Buñuel and screened during his first one-man show in Paris in 1929. The film exhibited many surrealist images, including this image of a hand with an anthole, a severed hand in a street, bodies jumping from one room to the next, a man pulling two grand pianos topped with dead donkeys, as well as the image of an eye being sliced from the title slide. The surrealist imagery within the film, along with his one-man show, created a surrealist powerhouse that propelled him into the public eye, and he became the surrealist man of the hour, which earned him a great review by Breton that also came with a sort of warning of Dali's superego. In the film, you can clearly see Dali's paranoid critical method realized through his dreamlike imagery with a paranoid undertone and expression of insanity. Man Ray. Man Ray, already a Dadaist, became the most well-known surrealist photographer of his time. Through photography, he was able to literalize dreams and endow them with a sense of invincible reality, carrying forward Dali and Magritte's ideas of illusionism. It was during this time that he also created photographs without a camera in a process called rayographs, which created ghostly images of real-life objects. Surrealist object, Marat Oppenheim. During this time, Surrealism was not limited to painting and photography, although Surrealist sculpture was far more limited. One of the most iconic Surrealist sculptures displayed at the Breton Gallery is Marat Oppenheim's object, which is a fur-covered teacup, saucer, and spoon. The fur imbues the cup with a sort of animalistic life, which is incongruous and jarring in a domestic setting. Thus, the process of disorientation present in Surrealist paintings were applied directly to real-life objects. Alberto Giacometti. In 1929, Alberto Giacometti became a member of the Surrealist group, and through his objects expressed his feelings on love, fetishism, sexual aggression, and sadomasochism. This was a common theme amongst the Surrealists, especially artists like Salvador Dali and Hans Bellmer, a painter and sculptor who at times crossed the line of what was appropriate. This can especially be seen in Giacometti's work, Woman with Her Throat Cut, which embodies what we can imply is a sexual murder and elements of female anatomy. Ultimately, his work also influenced Jean Arp and Max Ernst, who were also making surrealist sculptures at this time. While less violent, The Palace at 4 a.m. similarly represents Giacometti's obsessive yet brief love affair with a woman through an open wire cage, which would become a precursor for the open form welded sculptures that would be made in America after World War II. Frida Kahlo. Frida Kahlo was creating artwork around the same time as a surrealist, but she clearly stated that she was not a surrealist artist herself. Although her work seems to have surrealist tendencies and dreamlike imagery, her work was rooted in her political and cultural beliefs. She took the majority of her inspiration from the Aztec culture, specifically Coatlicue, an Aztec goddess. This imagery is replicated in many of Frida's works. Conclusion. This week we explored the way in which Marcel Duchamp and the Dada movement challenged traditional notions of art through their artistic parody and subversion, to bewilder and intimidate spectators. To protest the futility and charade of world war, the Dadaists explored new forms of artistic expression through absurd imagery and ready-mades. On the other hand, the Surrealists were a highly organized group who gathered around André Breton in Paris in 1924 and began to employ new methods of inspiration in their artwork, taking into consideration the work of Sigmund Freud and focusing on the mind and dreams. Through both the biomorphic and naturalistic branches of Surrealism, these artists explored dreamlike imagery and questioned the border between reality and the subconscious.